Hi all, Steve Jobs was an American businessman, inventor, and investor best known for co-founding the technology company Apple Incorporated. Jobs was also the founder of Next and the chairman and majority shareholder of Pixar. He was a pioneer of the personal computer revolution of the 1970s. Let's go through the mindset of a very brilliant person and get to know what we need to learn from him.
After education, his career begins in 1974. In 1974, Steve gets his first job at video game maker at Atari. In 1976, Steve and Woz show off the early Apple I board at the Homebrew Computer Club. The Apple Computer Inc. is incorporated by Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Ron Wayne. They started to present Apple I at the Personal Computing Festival and sell it. In 1977, former Intel executive Mike Markkula invests in Apple and hires former colleague Mike Scott as CEO. Apple makes a huge sensation at the West Coast Computer Fair with a prototype Apple II. In 1978, the Apple II becomes the first impressive personal computer in the U.S. Apple becomes a revolution in U.S. In the company, work starts on the Apple III and the Lisa, while Jeff Raskin begins writing the Book of Macintosh. In 1979, sales of Apple II skyrocket after introducing the spreadsheet software VisiCalc. In 1980, Apple launches Apple III, which was a flop, and Apple goes public, increasing Steve Jobs' net worth from dozens of millions of dollars to over $200 million. In 1981, Apple CEO Mike Scott laid off 50 Apple employees without notice. Then the board asks Steve Jobs to leave, and Mike Markkula becomes interim CEO. Jeff Raskin is forced out of his Macintosh project as Steve Jobs takes over. IBM launches the IBM PC. It was the biggest threat to Apple's future. In 1982, a portrait of Steve Jobs ends up on the cover of Time magazine, under the title Striking It Rich. Steve trusts Time correspondent Michael Moritz to follow him on the Mac team for months, hoping to become Man of the Year. In 1983, Time instead makes the Computer Machine of the Year and publishes a hatchet job on Steve Jobs. In the same year, launch of the Lisa computer happens. The Lisa team later merges with the Mac team under Steve Jobs' leadership. In April 1983, PepsiCo CEO John Sculley becomes Apple's CEO after having been wooed by Steve Jobs for several months. In 1984, Macintosh was launched at Apple's annual shareholder meeting. In 1985, Apple's board sides with John Sculley and strips Steve off all executive duties. Alan Kay first introduces the Pixar team to Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs resigns from Apple and starts Next with 5 other refugees from Apple. Apple announces it will sue Next. In 1986, Jobs buys the computer division of George Lucas's ILM for $10 million and incorporates it as Pixar. Pixar unveils John Lasseter's short film Luxo Jr. at SIGGRAPH. It is praised by the expert audience as one of the first computer-animated work of art. In 1987, Ross Perot invests $20 million in Next, based on a $125 million valuation. The Next computer is still under development. In 1988, Next and IBM form a partnership to have Next software run on IBM machines. Steve Jobs unveils the Next Cube in San Francisco to great critical acclaim, pitching it as a workstation for higher education. Pixar launches its new computer graphics workstation, the Pixar Image Computer 2, and starts working on the RenderMan computer animation software. At SIGGRAPH, Pixar releases its new short tin toy. It will end up winning 1988's Academy Award for Best Animated Short Film. In 1989, Next partners with retailer Businessland to sell to corporate America. Steve Jobs is named Entrepreneur of the Decade by Inc. magazine. Steve shuts down all of Pixar's hardware operations. Canon invests $100 million in Next, now valued at $600 million. Steve introduces the cheaper Next station in San Francisco to boost the modest sales of Next hardware. In 1991, Steve Jobs fires almost half of Pixar's staff and takes back all of the employees' stock in an effort to cut costs, as the company is still in the red 5 years after its launch. Pixar signs a deal with Disney to make a computer-animated feature film. In 1992, Next licenses its operating system, Next Step, to run on Intel's x86 machines. In 1993, Next fires 300 employees as it discontinues all its hardware operations and becomes Next Software Inc. Next Co. Peter Van Cuylenburg attempts for competitor Sun to buy Next. Sun CEO Scott McNealy warns Steve Jobs of the betrayal. Disney's Jeffrey Katzenberg puts a halt to the development of Toy Story because of creative disagreements. In 1994, Pixar resumes work on Toy Story. In 1995, Steve starts focusing less on Next and more on Pixar before Toy Story is released. He becomes president-CEO of Pixar Animation Studios. 1 week after Toy Story is out, Pixar goes public. Steve Jobs' worth rises to $1.5 billion, more than it ever was during his first tenure at Apple. In 1996, Steve Jobs negotiates a breakthrough deal between Pixar and Disney with its CEO Michael Eisner. The deal includes landmark rights for a studio, such as Equal Billing Apple, which was desperately looking for a modern operating system to buy, eventually buys Next for $400 million. Steve Jobs is named informal advisor to Apple CEO Gil Amelio. In 1997, Gil Amelio is ousted by the Apple board of directors after a disastrous quarter. Steve Jobs is named interim CEO in his place and installs his next executive team at the top of Apple. Steve Jobs introduces Apple's new board of directors and a truce with Microsoft at Macworld Boston. Apple starts its Think Different campaign to restore its damaged brand image. In 1998, at Macworld, Steve Jobs announces that Apple is profitable again, thanks to sales of the new Power Macintosh computers. Steve Jobs introduces Apple's revolutionary iMac at the Flint Center Auditorium in Cupertino, 14 years after he had introduced the Macintosh at that same place. In 1999, Steve Jobs introduces the new Power Mac G3 and the color iMacs at Macworld San Francisco. The original iBook is unveiled at Macworld New York with the tagline iMac to go, introduction of the iMac DV for digital video, and iMovie. The first of Apple's first digital hub app happens. The next 4 years from 2000 to 2004 were a remarkable period of success for Apple with Steve Jobs. In 2000, Steve Jobs becomes Apple's CEO. At Macworld San Francisco, Steve Jobs drops the interim in his title and officially becomes Apple's CEO. He also demos Mac OS X's revolutionary Aqua interface to a bewildered audience. The Power Mac G4 Cube is unveiled at Macworld NY in 2001. Steve Jobs unveils Apple's digital hub strategy at Macworld SF. The Mac is to become the center of consumers' emerging digital lifestyles. After 4 years of hard work, Mac OS X 10.0, which was built on top of Next technology, finally ships. Apple opens its first retail stores in Tysons Corner, Virginia and Glendale, California. After an 8-month crash development program, Steve Jobs unveils iPod at a small media event on the company's campus. He has no idea how it will transform Apple. In 2002, Steve unveils the iMac G4 and the fourth iApp iPhoto at Macworld San Francisco. Apple starts its popular Switch campaign with ads picturing PC users that switch to the Mac. Steve Jobs introduces the first Windows-compatible iPods at Macworld NY. In 2003, Apple opens the revolutionary online iTunes Music Store in the US, after negotiating landmark deals with all major music labels. Steve Jobs announces that Pixar is seeking a new distributor to replace Disney after its contract expires. Steve Jobs unveils the Power Mac G5, the world's fastest computer, at WWDC 03. Steve Jobs introduces iTunes for Windows and further demonstrates Apple's growing lead over its competitors in the digital music business. In 2004, Steve unveils the iPod Mini and the iLife suite at Macworld. The iPod Mini will soon become the world's best-selling MP3 player and truly establish Apple as a consumer electronics powerhouse. From 2005 to 2011, so many products were introduced by Apple under the leadership of Steve Jobs, such as the iPad, iPhone, etc. In the year 2006, the Walt Disney Company acquired Pixar for $7.4 billion. Pixar's largest shareholder, Steve Jobs, joins the Disney board, while Ed Catmull becomes president of Walt Disney Animation Studios, and John Lasseter becomes its chief creative officer. This success journey of Apple continued until his resignation as CEO of Apple in 2011. Steve Jobs was not just a person who developed a personal computer and sold it to make money. He was a very talented entrepreneur and brilliant businessman who was capable of handling any situations that came in front of him to stop his success journey. The Apple company was trying to take the product, the Apple computer which he developed, and after getting it, they pulled him away. But he did not give up, because he trusted himself more than any other person who invested in him. This confidence was the key to starting his own company Next. Apple faced a big threat from Next. Actually, the threat was Steve Jobs itself. He gave Apple no option other than to acquire Next for their existence. We can see a developer and builder of a new product, as well as a brilliant businessman in Steve Jobs. The decisions he made in certain situations and the efforts he has given to his work to reach the public with his products were remarkable ones. The application of technology and products in the field of entertainment was his main sales strategy to drive business growth. He proved that it was not the wrong choice. He believed that if someone cannot love what they do, they cannot succeed. So he always loved his products more than anything. He had the option to give up when Apple took his computer and left him alone, but he was not the one who sold and left. Instead, He was the one who tried to return to take what he deserved and own what he made as long as he was here in the world. And he said, "The only way to do great work is to love what you do."